Hello, welcome to Mini Episode Monday. It's August 22nd, 2022. The chart that caught my attention this past week was the chart of Manti Te'o, a football player who has been featured in a documentary on Netflix called The Girl Who Didn't Exist, The Girlfriend Who Didn't Exist. And the story is that Manti Te'o was a star football player at Notre Dame from 2009 to 2012. He received a lot of attention when he revealed that his girlfriend had died of leukemia. And so this story, a very sympathetic story, swept the country, and it attracted the notice of some investigative journalists who looked into the story deeper and came to the conclusion that this girlfriend, Lene, had never existed. And it came as a great surprise to many people, including Manti himself. It turns out that Manti had been catfished by a very troubled individual who had created a fake profile of this beautiful young lady named Lene, who had then reached out through Facebook to Manti. And they had formed a connection and they communicated through email and eventually would talk by phone, but they never met in person. And so this seemed very weird to people. The confusion continued. Nobody exactly knew what had happened. And so this documentary, 10 years later, is Manti's chance to tell his story, and then the person who catfished him, this person, Ronaya, to tell their story. But we know also that astrology can bring some clarity to a very confusing circumstance. So let's take a look at Manti Te'o's chart. We see that he is an Aquarian, born January 26th in 1991. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a birth time for him, so we aren't looking at the house placements. We're just looking at the planets themselves and their aspects to each other. We see that he's an Aquarian sun, somebody who's forward-looking, interested in technology. And so that would explain, someone who might be interested in getting on social media, which was still fairly new at that time in 2009 when the catfishing began. Also, Aquarians tend to feel a little out of step with the mainstream. They're originals. They don't really feel like they have a large community of people. So they look for people that are more like them, more like-minded people. They like to find their own community as kind of a little band of outsiders. And so this is reinforced in Manti's chart because Venus is also in Aquarius. And so Venus he would be open to relationships that were maybe less than traditional. Certainly an electronic relationship, with Aquarius. But also you see that his Aquarius planets are very well supported by the moon. Because we don't have a time for him, the moon at noon was at 20 degrees, which tells us it could have been anywhere from 13 to 26 degrees on the day he was born. So that Gemini moon does support the Aquarian Venus and Sun. And so Aquarian moon connects through words, through language. Venus and Sun in Aquarius connecting through technology. So people say, how could he form a relationship with someone he'd never actually physically met? And you think, well, so long as they form that bond through words, through language, I think that he's going to find it very meaningful. And this being an Aquarian kind of out of step with the mainstream was very true in Manti's case. He was of Samoan descent. He'd grown up in Hawaii. And so this was not a culture that is very well represented in college football or at Notre Dame University. So he was kind of a lone person there. And also he grew up a Mormon. And so he was in a Catholic university. So he really did not have a large community of people who shared his faith. And so as he connected with this Lanai, she revealed that she also has Samoan ancestry. And so that kind of gave him a bond, something that he could connect with. So when he was feeling a little alienated in the world around him, he could turn on his computer and find somebody who really got him and understood him. So that also could explain why this remote relationship could go on for 3 years. But let's look at this Gemini moon. It's ruled by Mercury and communication, what's happening in Manti's chart. And you say, okay, well, Mercury with Neptune here, he could be very open to being deceived and kind of seeing what he wants to see. But look at this lineup of planets in Capricorn. 1991, early 1991, was a very significant time because we had a Uranus Neptune conjunction going on at that time. And this was the beginning of the internet. In late 1990 was the first time the World Wide Web was up and running. And so you see with Manti having a very close conjunction to this Uranus-Neptune conjunction of a personal planet, his Mercury, which rules his moon and his Mars, would make him kind of become part of that zeitgeist, that he could get caught up in this new wave of technology and kind of ride with it. And then you think, okay, who's in charge of all these Saturn planets? And you see that it's Saturn itself is actually in Capricorn in its own sign. And Capricorn has a lot to do in his chart because it rules the 3 other Capricorn planets, but it also rules his Sun and Venus. So this is a guy who's in charge in his chart. And to give it an extra power, we see that it's conjunct the North Node, which amplifies the energy of a planet. And so a Saturn in Capricorn is someone who's very ambitious, but also very responsible. And you see that Saturn is someone who maybe takes the weight of others' cares on its shoulders. And throughout his relationship with Lanai, she shared, different health concerns she had and made him feel like he alone was kind of saving her and keeping her going. So that was another aspect of this chart that is in play at the time that this incident is taking place. So let's look actually at the time itself. The catfishing began in 2009. And we see what is happening then in his chart by transit. We see Neptune, which, is very close when he was born, was very close to that Mercury. It's moved into Aquarius and it's now approaching Venus, but notice it's also squaring Pluto. He has in his chart a Venus-Pluto square, and that Neptune is setting off that square during these years. So you think about a Venus square Pluto could be a hidden relationship, a secret relationship somewhere, something where a lot of manipulation and control is going on. And so an Aquarius Venus is normally very open and sharing and friendly, but yet there's some sort of Plutonian force that's kind of latched onto that and is kind of taking advantage of it and manipulating it. And so Venus is working throughout these 3 years, 2009 to 2012, setting off this square. Neptune is approaching Venus and setting off its square to Pluto. But when Manti learns that Lanai has, quote unquote, died, what's happening in his chart then? And so this is in 2012. So we'll do Manti's chart with the 2012 Neptune. And you see Neptune has moved into Pisces here. But what's it doing now in his chart? It's passed over his Venus. And so now he makes the announcement, his girlfriend has died in September of 2012. The journalists start digging into the story. And in January of 2013, they published a story that Lanai did not exist. And so you see that Manti also has another square in his chart with Venus. Mars has just moved to an out of sign square. They're still just 4 degrees apart. So we've got Venus square Mars in his chart, and Neptune at this point is setting off that square and is exactly square to Mars. And so you think of Mars as kind of aggressive energy, and Gemini journalists energy have come to kind of attack, to pierce holes, all different things Mars will do in his romantic relationship, and to Mars or Neptune up here in Pisces to dissolve it, to show that it was just made of air. It never really existed. So it's interesting then how he's had this kind of Neptunian journey. He certainly had other things happening in his chart during this time. You know, Pluto has started its entry into Capricorn, and it's going to go through Capricorn and meet all the planets in the stellium as he kind of struggles to deal with this, begins an NFL career that never really quite takes off. But also, if we look at the aspects for the day the documentary was dropped on August 16th, we see something else is happening in his chart. We see that Uranus, which is television, broadcasting, is right down here at 18 degrees of Taurus. And it's going to go retrograde back over this 15 degrees of Capricorn. And the North Node is with it. And so we see a trine is really being created with this stellium of Mercury, Neptune, and Uranus. So technology is, this is a trine aspect, is bringing this story back to life and giving it legs, giving it some sort of foundation of understanding. And also we see Neptune has moved well beyond his Venus, and is also creating a trine to Chiron, his natal Chiron, which shows a kind of healing. And if you watch the documentary, you'll see that it's very apparent that he has processed this over the past 10 years. And he's come to a point where he learned to forgive the person who catfished him, Ronaya, but also has come to forgive himself. And so that's a story of not just what happened, but the process of coming to terms with it, learning to heal is very apparent. And then finally, Pluto itself is approaching that North Node Saturn, that person who feels so responsible. Manti does say at the end of the series that telling his story was very painful, but he believes if it helps anybody, it's definitely worth doing. So again, that kind of carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. So that's just an example of how astrology can take a story that's very confusing, not sure what happened, and give us some signposts that point us towards what was going on with the person involved and with the transits that were happening to his natal chart. Unfortunately, we don't have a birth time for Ronaya. I will keep an eye online to see if that information ever shows up, because it sure would be fascinating to look at the synastry between those two charts. But in any case, thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.